Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
Hello, it's good to be back. How are you doing today?
I'm fantastic, thank you. I'm really ready to unpack some fascinating concepts today that I think cut right to the heart of how we all live our lives.
I agree. The sources we have in front of us, they're complex. They focus on one of the most persistent and yet most questioned aspects of human civilization. Traditions.
And specifically how we figure out their true value.
Exactly.
So the fundamental question we're really addressing for you, the listener, is whether traditions, cultural rituals, social etiquette, even family customs, should they be rigidly upheld or should they be discarded?
And we got a whole stack of sources that challenge the easy answers, the black and white thinking.
Right. No simple yes or no here.
And that's really our mission today. We know, as experts in this field, the answer is rarely simple. Our goal is to provide you with a framework, a set of criteria, really, to intelligently assess the function and value of any tradition in your own life. This isn't about moralizing. It's about assessment based on one thing: functionality.
Okay, so let's start with the initial assessment from the source materials. They looked at a huge list of cultural practices, and the conclusion was, well, it was almost unanimous.
It was. When researchers asked people for a verdict on these common traditions, the response was consistently ambiguous. The dominant verdict, and I love how the sources put this, basically translates to, it depends on the situation.
That ambiguity really struck me. We're talking about everything from, hand kissing during holidays to huge social contracts like asking for a daughter's hand in marriage.
The Concepttion ritual, yes. And even things like providing meals after a funeral, the Sociology.
And it wasn't just the serious stuff. Even lighter practices like coffee fortune-telling or medically significant ones like circumcision, they all fell into that "it depends" category.
No universal mandate for any of them.
But here's the fascinating part. Out of this huge list, only 2 things were labeled as unequivocally necessary.
Hospitality and good neighbor relations.
That's it. So what does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that those 2 things are about basic communal survival. But everything else, it's ambiguous because traditions aren't static. They exist in a dynamic context: social, historical, economic.
So what worked in a village 50 years ago might just be a burden in a city today.
Precisely. A rigid definition is doomed to fail because it doesn't account for that necessary cultural evolution.
Okay, so if the answer is always "it depends," then we need a compass to navigate the situation. And that leads us to the core idea in the sources: the true definition of conservatism and this crucial test of functionality.
Right. And we absolutely have to distinguish between the popular idea of conservatism, just preserving the past for its own sake, and what we could call functional conservatism.
Okay.
True conservatism, in its original sense, is actually a deeply progressive and reparative movement.
That sounds like a complete contradiction. Progressive.
It does, but think about it. The core tenet isn't about preserving artifacts. It's about maximizing utility. The principle is incredibly simple. You keep what works, and you change, repair, or just get rid of what doesn't.
So if a tradition stops working?
A true conservative perspective demands you change it, not cling to it.
I love that. It shifts the whole conversation from sentimentality to pure utility. So how do we define what works?
That is the test of functionality. Yuslo Selig. A tradition is functional if it genuinely eases life, protects you, or helps the community live together without creating, unnecessary friction.
Within the context of today's world.
Of course. Within our current needs and technology. And a tradition becomes non-functional when it does the opposite. When it creates friction, hinders you, complicates life. At that point, it just has to change.
This framing makes tradition sound less like a dusty old rule book and more like, well, the sources call it an algorithm.
It is an algorithm,
Yeah.
a time-tested one. Traditions are basically pre-programmed behavioral codes for situations of uncertainty. They tell you how to behave so you don't have to waste precious mental energy figuring it out from scratch every single time.
Can you expand on that idea, the psychological safety net? I think that's one of the most powerful insights here.
Of course. Take funeral rituals. When a person suffers a sudden catastrophic loss, their rational will can just collapse. They're paralyzed by grief. They can't think.
They don't know what to do next.
Exactly. So the preset rituals, the gatherings, the 7th day, the 40th day, they aren't intellectual exercises. They are mandates for action. They force the person to follow a structure, to stay engaged, and that structure allows them to survive the initial shock without trembling.
It's a scaffold that holds you up when your own internal structure has failed.
That's a perfect way to put it. The rituals literally keep you alive by requiring you to act, even when you have no will to do so. The tradition is the safety net.
Which makes the question of changing these things so much more complex. You're not just giving up an old habit, you're deleting a piece of cognitive code.
Yes.
So when does a society decide, okay, this code needs an update?
Well, the sources point to three key drivers. First, increased income and affluence. Wealth gives you the bandwidth to question things. Second, higher education levels. And third, more exposure to different cultures.
When you see your neighbor has a better way of doing something.
Your own way comes under immediate scrutiny. Exactly.
But the sources also have a pretty stark warning about how we go about rejecting things.
They do. They caution against what they call the adolescent rejection, that sort of sweeping, blind dismissal of all traditions just to be modern.
Why is that so dangerous?
Because you aren't replacing the old algorithm with a new, better one. You're just deleting it entirely.
Leaving a person rootless.
Exactly. Unstable, vulnerable, having to solve every complex social problem from square one.
Yeah.
Look, cultural evolution is inevitable. It can be slow, but it happens. Resisting it when the function is truly gone is just futile.
And this loss of function can lead to some really strange contradictions.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources mention this amazing anecdote. Someone was producing a video arguing against the depiction of religious figures, right? But they completely missed the irony that their own video is made of 24 static frames per second.
The very mechanism that some of those old edicts were trying to grapple with, it's a perfect example. You're following the surface level rule, but you're totally blind to the fact that the underlying principle or function has been completely transformed by technology.
The original meaning is just gone.
Vanished.
Yeah.
But the argument stays stuck on the surface.
Let's pivot a bit to a more troubling aspect of this, the relationship between tradition, power, and our own psychological needs.
Right. We find that in communities with, say, low competence, or where people feel less effective, traditions can be very powerful tools for control.
How so?
Well, a system can use tradition not to enlighten people, but to indoctrinate them. The goal is often to keep individuals feeling perpetually inadequate, always lacking something, always needing more guidance from the system.
So if that's the risk, why not just go for radical individualism, discard all of it?
Because life is overwhelmingly complex. The human mind, as powerful as it is, simply isn't built to manage everything alone. Without our biological traditions, our evolutionary heritage, and our cultural traditions, all that accumulated social wisdom, we'd be paralyzed. You need that external memory.
And this ties directly back to our biology. The sources make a strong case for simple things, like visiting family and friends.
This is a crucial point, and one we often forget in modern life. When you do that ritual, visiting someone, asking how they are, sharing a meal, especially with physical touch, you trigger a cocktail of hormones. It's rooted in millions of years of evolution.
And it improves well-being for both people.
Absolutely. So when you skip those visits because they feel inconvenient, there's a real biological cost. That feeling of emptiness isn't just nostalgia. It's a neurochemical need for structured social connection that isn't being met.
But that pendulum swings both ways. That essential structure can become a cage. When does tradition cross that line into oppression?
It becomes oppressive when it actively hinders your function or prevents necessary evolution. The classic mechanism is social pressure, mahali baskusi. Fear of being judged or ostracized stops people from even discussing a change, even if everyone knows the tradition is broken.
And we see that weaponized politically all the time.
In every nation state. This obsession with heroic historical narratives, the epic TV dramas, the constant talk of great ancestors, it's often a manufactured tool. It creates this idealized, sanctified past to critique the present and enforce a kind of conformity.
It's a political function, not a cultural one.
Right. It's about building a common psyche, not necessarily a useful life.
So if we need a universal test, a criterion to judge if a tradition is good or evil, where do we find it?
The sources point to a beautiful ethical framework, one from Aldo Leopold. To judge any tradition, you ask a simple question. Does it support the diversity, beauty, and life itself?
So anything that expands life's potential is good.
Precisely. Anything that supports variety, encourages communication, fosters mercy.
Yeah.
That is functionally good.
And the opposite defines an evil tradition.
Yes. A tradition is evil if it reduces diversity, suppresses communication, or favors one group while making life harder for others. Think of any ideology that says, only our sect will be saved. Anything that shrinks the circle of compassion is, by this definition, detrimental.
This brings us back to that central conflict,
Yeah.
freedom versus restriction. We assume tradition limits freedom.
But the sources push back hard on that. We have to clarify what freedom özgürlük really is. It's not just doing whatever you want.
No.
No, freedom is the ability to make a rational decision despite your immediate impulses. If you just follow every desire, you're not free. You're a slave to that desire.
Which means a restriction can actually be liberating.
It can be. Think of a rule that limits a behavior that leads to addiction. That rule can be seen as liberating. It protects you, especially young people, from urges that could enslave them, which expands their real freedom in the long run.
So the goal is a kind of rational harmony, being able to adapt.
Exactly. A functional person can adapt and thrive in different environments. The great sin, as the sources put it, is demanding that everyone else conform to your single perspective. It's a desire for the disappearance of anyone unlike you.
So in the end, we're left with this tension between reason akal and traditional memory bellic.
It's a constant dynamic. Reason is essential for critique, for assessment, but we have to accept that our individual minds can't handle the universe alone. We need the accumulated wisdom, that vast memory of tradition, to navigate life.
So modern values, science, logic, they give us a compass, but they can't chart the entire map.
They can't. Some moral situations are just too complex and time-sensitive. The only working answer is the one tradition provides. It must be this way because this way has worked.
It's the ultimate shortcut.
It is. And if true freedom is the ability to change your mind, which is the ultimate sign that reason is truly at work, then we have to ask you, the listener, what tradition are you holding on to right now? Not out of belief, not because it's functional, but simply because you haven't yet found the strength to rationally decide its purpose.